The United Blood Nation, or the Bloods, is a violent criminal street gang with thousands of members up and down the East Coast, from New York to Florida to right here in North Carolina. And these three defendants seated at that table are the leaders. As the top leaders of the UBN, they have power and control over Blood members in our communities, both in prison and on the streets. They are the CEOs, the presidents, the supervisors, the managers of the Bloods. Now, many of us have bosses at our jobs. If you're a Blood, these are your bosses. This is who the Bloods work for. What kind of work do the Bloods do in our communities? The evidence will show that the UBN, as it's called, or the United Blood Nation, or the Bloods, is a criminal enterprise that deals drugs, commits robberies, does acts involving murder, fraud, and even the destruction of justice and violent assault. Seated at this table right here in front of you, in the middle, in the gray shirt and glasses, is Pedro Gutierrez, or as you hear him referred to over the course of this, Magoo, Goo, light skin, and light, and Inferno. He is the chairman of what's called the UBN Council, which is the governing body of all Bloods on the East Coast. He's also the godfather of a subset of Bloods known as the 9 Trey Gangsters. In the Bloods organization, no one is above him. No one is more powerful than him. You can say he's the CEO of the Bloods. And despite the fact that he's been located in a prison cell in New York State Prison, he has power and control over the Bloods in North Carolina. They obey his orders. Seated to his right in the blue shirt and red tie is Defendant James Baxton, or as you'll hear him referred to over the course of this trial, Frank White, FW, and Grown. He is also a high-ranking member of the United Blood Nation and the 9 Trey Gangster subset. He is the rank of what's called a worldwide high, or a AAA high. You can say he's an executive of the Bloods organization. And like Defendant Gutierrez, despite the fact that he's been located for years in a prison cell in New York State, he has the power to order Bloods in North Carolina to do work for him. And finally, seated on the left in the white shirt is Defendant Cynthia Gilmore. She's a local member of the United Blood Nation and the 9 Trey Gangsters. She has power and control over the Bloods here in this state. And it's part of her duties. She's traveled frequently from North Carolina to New York State to report directly to Defendant Gutierrez on the activities of Bloods here in North Carolina. You could say she's the manager of the local North Carolina Bloods franchise. These are the three defendants in this case, and you'll get to know who they are and what they do by listening to their own words on audio recordings such as wiretaps and jail calls and body wires. Over the course of this trial, the evidence is going to take you inside the criminal enterprise, that is, the United Blood Nation, and the 9 Trey Gangster subset, audio recordings, testimony of the victims and witnesses, and federal agents, and documents and photos and phones and Facebooks. All of it will come together to prove to you how the UBN, as it's called, operates. You'll learn about the history of the gang. You'll hear how it started in the early 1990s as a prison gang in New York State. Sets of Bloods come together under one umbrella, the United Blood Nation, or UBN, or the U. You'll hear that's comprised of about 10 or 12 different subsets, one of which being the 9 Trey Gangster subsets of which these three defendants are members. You'll hear that the 9 Trey Gangsters are the original sets of Bloods and that they're the most powerful. They're called the leaders and the enforcer sets of the Bloods. And that the godfather of the 9 Trey Gangsters, Pedro Gutierrez, also sits on the UBN Council as the chairman over all the Blood sets. You'll hear how Defendant Gutierrez and Defendant Baxton have been running the Bloods for years from prison in New York State, and they have control over Bloods in North Carolina from Gastonia to Shelby, from Iredell County to right here in Charlotte. Defendant Baxton and Defendant Gutierrez have control, and they do it with the help of people like Defendant Gilmore, locals. You'll hear what it takes to become a member of the United Blood Nation. You need to be savagely beat in for 31 seconds. You must take an oath to swear that you will be a Blood until the day you die. You swear that you will uphold the 31 rules of the United Blood Nation, and you will see what those rules are. And you will see that some of those rules, a violation of those, is punishable by death. You'll hear there's a ranking system. There's a structure. There's ranks from Godfather like Defendant Gutierrez to highs like Defendant Baxton, down to lows, 5-star general, 4-star general, all the way to street-level soldiers and scraps. You'll hear that the Bloods speak in a special language and they write in a special code. They do that to avoid detection from law enforcement. Instead of cocaine, they'll say Scarface. Instead of Trey 9 Gangster, they'll say Billy. Instead of murder, they'll say Peter Roll. You'll hear that UBN members pay dues. There's 3 things you are going to hear about the dues. 1, that the UBN members must pay dues, and there are severe consequences to not paying dues. Beaten up, stabbed, cut, even branded if you fail to pay your dues on time. 2, the dues money flows upwards up the pyramid to the top leaders of the Bloods, and you'll hear recordings of each of these 3 defendants. You'll see text messages with these defendants demand their gang dues. They want their money. They want that cash. And where does that money come from? 3rd point. UBN members commit crimes to generate cash to pay these gang dues. They deal drugs. They do fraud. They commit robbery. That's where the money comes from. You'll also hear how Bloods move up in rank. They put in work. They commit violent acts ordered by their leaders. They also pay their dues. Now, Judge Whitney is going to instruct you on the law, and when he does, you should pay very close attention to how he describes it and how he explains it, but I want to touch on it very briefly. Simply put, it is illegal to agree to commit a crime. That's called conspiracy. These 3 defendants are charged with a particular kind of conspiracy. They're charged with agreeing that some member or affiliate of the Bloods will commit at least 2 acts such as robbery, drug dealing, acts involving murder, obstruction of justice, or fraud. That's called a racketeering conspiracy or violation of the RICO Act, which you may have heard my colleague Andrew talk a little bit about yesterday. The evidence will show you that the UBN commits racketeering acts. Now, what kinds of racketeering acts are you guys going to hear about over the course of the trial? Well, first, UBN members deal drugs. You will hear the testimony of UBN members themselves testifying that UBN members deal drugs, that they team up to deal drugs together, that lower-level members get supplied by high-level members, and they sell those drugs in the community, that UBN members teach each other the proper way to process, package, and deliver and sell drugs. You will see the cell phone records of the North Carolina UBN member known as Hardbody, and in those cell phone records you will see the text messages between Hardbody and Defendant Gilmore, wherein you will see they sell cocaine together. You'll even hear recordings of Defendant Baxton and Defendant Gutierrez arguing over who gets Hardbody's gang dues. You will hear recordings of Defendant Baxton telling people that he has heroin smuggled into prison for him to sell. Next, the Bloods commit robberies. Again, you will hear testimony of UBN members, and they will tell you that UBN members commit robberies to generate cash to pay their dues, and that they're even taught by other UBN members the proper way to commit these robberies so they don't get caught. And one example you will hear on wiretaps, jail calls, and other recordings, Defendant Gutierrez called another Bloods member named Bandana down to Florida. On the call, he says, "What's going on? I haven't received my dues from the Charlotte Bloods in a while. Get on top of that." As any subordinate would do when told to do something by his leader, Bandana calls the local Charlotte leaders known as Drips. You'll hear these recordings and hear, "Light just called me. Where's the money? Who do you have sending it to Light?" Drips then calls and texts all the local Charlotte area Bloods, dozens of 9-tray gangsters, as is his job, and reaches out to them and says, "Where's the dues money? Who's supposed to be paying it? Management has noticed that we're not doing our jobs right now. We're going to get in trouble." You'll see that this culminates in an all-hands meeting of dozens of 9-tray gangsters here in Charlotte. You'll hear the testimony of federal agents who surveilled this meeting both on the ground and in the air. And what comes out of this meeting? You will hear a call from a local Charlotte area Blood of the 9-tray gangster called Drips, his local leader, and say, "I need to generate some cash. Do you know about any robberies I can commit in the area?" This chain reaction of a telephone call from Defendant Gutierrez triggering a flurry of activity here in Charlotte, like dozens of 9-tray gangsters, one call, dozens of 9-tray gangsters in response is an example of the power of the UBN leadership. Next, we will present evidence that Defendant Gilmore herself participated in a robbery. Defendant Gilmore was caught by the Raleigh Police Department acting as a getaway driver for a fellow UBN member who had just committed a violent home invasion robbery of a home wherein he and 3 other UBN members ransacked the home, shot someone, and stole their belongings. Cell phone records seized from Ms. Gilmore's car will confirm that she was involved in the robbery both before and after. Next, the Bloods obstruct justice. It's one of those rules I mentioned earlier. One of the 31 rules that every member must abide by is that no UBN member is to ever cooperate with law enforcement. They're not even allowed to admit that the Bloods exist or that they're a member. And you will hear that a violation of this rule is punishable by death. You will hear what's called a worldwide menu, which is a list of former UBN members who cooperated with law enforcement who are now marked for death. You will hear it's every UBN member's responsibility. If you see someone on the worldwide menu, you have to act. You have to. Next, the Bloods even commit fraud schemes. You will hear recordings of Defendant Baxton from prison calling the family members of fellow inmates. The mothers and the sisters are fortunate enough to have a family member in prison with them. He calls them and says, "Unless you pay me hundreds of dollars, your son, your brother, in prison with me is going to get killed." And not only that, you'll hear on these recordings him tell these mothers and these sisters that unless they pay that money, people are going to come to their houses as well and hurt them and hurt their families. You'll hear the testimony from these individuals. You also are going to hear testimony and evidence that the Bloods are involved in acts involving murder and violent assaults. You're going to learn what it means to be marked as food or on the plate. As I said, if you're on the plate or you're marked as food, that means you are identified for death, and it is every UBN member's or responsibility, per their oath and their rules, to act on it. There's a phrase, if you're food, you've been identified for death. If a member sees food, he must eat food, attack you, or kill you, or he will be food. He himself will be marked as food. You are going to hear evidence that Defendant Gutierrez put many people on the plate, marked many people as food. And one example, Defendant Gutierrez put an entire subset of the Bloods here in North Carolina on the plate. There is a subset of Bloods known as Pretty Tony, and they made the unfortunate mistake, kind of disregarding Defendant Gutierrez as the chairman counsel. They were acting as Bloods, and they didn't think they were officially sanctioned, given his role as the leader of the Bloods. You'll hear testimony of an all-hands Bloods meeting in Virginia that they call powwow. At this meeting, Defendant Gutierrez's order was transmitted to all members that if they see any Pretty Tony on the streets or in prison, they were to shoot first and ask questions later. Defendant Gutierrez did the same thing for someone known as Hotz. Mr. Hotz had the audacity to challenge Defendant Gutierrez for his position as the chairman of the UBN Council, supreme leader of all Bloods. How did Defendant Gutierrez react? He put Hotz on the plate, and you will see the evidence that Hotz was repeatedly attacked in various New York State prisons, cut and stabbed about the face. You also hear that Defendant Gutierrez did the same and ordered that someone named Polo is on the plate because Polo killed a close gang associate of Defendant Gutierrez. You'll hear the phrase DP, which means a disciplinary action, a violent assault that you can do on a lower-level gang member when they disregard your orders. You'll hear on recordings Defendant Gilmore talk and laugh about ordering DPs on fellow gang members because they simply annoyed her. How will you know that these racketeering acts occurred? How do you know these defendants agreed to those acts? You're going to hear evidence. First, you're going to hear the testimony of UBN members, of Bloods, criminals. They're going to testify for you because they are insiders. They know how the UBN works and the crimes that the UBN commits. Now, I want to be the first to tell you, you may not like them. They may come in here and sitting on the witness stand wearing a prison jumpsuit because they've been convicted of a crime or they've pled guilty, and they're now cooperating with the government in the hopes that they get a reduced sentence. But they've accepted responsibility for their actions, and they will testify for you about the crimes that they and the Bloods have committed. But you won't just hear the testimony of UBN members. You're going to see all types of different evidence. You're going to see correspondence between these defendants and other gang members intercepted by law enforcement. You're going to see Facebook records of gang members, cell phone records of gang members. You're going to see kites, which are secret messages passed between prison inmates. You're going to see what's called Inglewood, or internal gang documents. These are essentially the business records of the Bloods. They contain the history of the gang, the oath every gang member must take, the 31 rules, as I said, which are so important, the rosters, the rankings, the names. These are internal Blood documents that you are not meant to see. In fact, it's even one of the rules, one of the 31 rules that no Bloods members are to show these documents to outsiders like us. But you will see those documents and they will give an insight into how the Bloods work. Not only that, you're going to hear audio recordings. You will hear court-authorized wiretaps, jail calls, body wires of the gang members discussing gang business and discussing crimes. But you will also get evidence from the defendants themselves. They will provide some of the evidence in recording after recording, in conversation after conversation. You will hear from Defendant Gutierrez, from Defendant Gilmore, from Defendant Baxton themselves. the words out of their own mouths about how they run the UBN and the crimes they've committed. Ladies and gentlemen, after you had an opportunity to hear all the evidence, consider all the facts, my colleague Andrew Creighton will come before you. He will likely stand right here, and he's going to ask you to return a verdict. He's going to ask you to return a verdict, the only verdict that is consistent with both the law and the evidence, and the verdict for each of these three defendants is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Thank you for your time.